The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a trapped hum, and Hannah Clarke moved through Cedar Creek Medical's ICU with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory. 19 years of it. The antiseptic smell clung to her scrubs, that sharp, chemical bite mixed with something underneath it, something organic that no amount of bleach could fully erase. She checked the ventilator on bed 7 without being asked, adjusted the drip on bed 4, caught a lucifer line on bed 2 before it kinked. Small things. The kind of small things that kept people alive. The other nurses didn't look at her much. That was fine. Hannah preferred it that way. She'd been at Cedar Creek for 8 days. The paperwork said she was a registered nurse with 3 years of prior experience at a clinic in Austin that no longer existed. The paperwork was very good. The paperwork was supposed to be the only thing that existed. Dr. Caldwell stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, his silk tie the color of old money, his shoes polished to a shine that suggested someone else did the polishing. He was watching her. Not looking at her, watching her, the way a man watches something he's decided doesn't belong. His voice carried across the ICU, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "You see that one?" He nodded toward Hannah without bothering to lower his voice. "New hire. Charity case, nursing school pipeline or some such. I'll give her a week. 2 weeks if she's got actual grit, which she doesn't." He turned to the resident physician standing next to him, a young man named Torres who looked genuinely uncomfortable. $50 says she quits before her first paycheck clears. These types never last. No resilience. No stomach for real medicine. Hannah didn't look up from the 4 pump she was adjusting. The numbers on the screen glowed, 47 milliliters per hour. Potassium chloride. She watched the rate, then moved to the next bed. The next vital sign. The next small thing that mattered. What Dr. Caldwell didn't know, what nobody at Cedar Creek Medical knew, was that Hannah Clarke wasn't her real name. Her real identity had been erased 3 years ago with a kind of thoroughness that only the Pentagon could manage. The operation in Kandahar had gone sideways. An extraction point was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. 17 personnel made it out because of decisions made in the black, decisions that couldn't be acknowledged, couldn't be logged, couldn't be connected to any official record. The kind of decisions that required people to stop existing. Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had received her orders in a secure facility with no windows and no official designation. The voice on the other end of the classified line had been polite. Professional. Final, your record is being scrubbed. Your service is being archived under top secret classification, eyes only. You will establish a civilian identity. You will not contact your previous command. You will not surface. If you do, we cannot protect you, and certain parties will not hesitate to use that against you. Certain parties. It was a term that covered a lot of ground. It covered people who'd sworn they'd kill her if they ever found out she was the operator who'd burned their supply route. It covered foreign intelligence agencies who'd pay substantial money for information on how JSOC really moved in Helmand province. It covered the kind of darkness that made disappearing seem reasonable. So Hannah Clarke had become Hannah Clarke, the quiet nurse with steady hands and no history worth mentioning. The ICU doors hissed open. A trauma team wheeled in a stretcher, moving with the controlled urgency that meant serious injury but stable transport. The patient was unconscious, his chest wrapped in surgical dressing already spotted with seepage. The lead paramedic rattled off vitals in the compressed language of emergency medicine: 46-year-old male, 7 penetrating wounds to the thorax from fragmentary impact, initial BP 88/52, response to fluid resuscitation, sinus rhythm maintained through transport, 2 units whole blood administered, ETA stable. Hannah moved to the assigned bed without being told. Bed 3, isolation protocol, monitor set up for post-trauma observation. She'd done this before. She'd done versions of this in places where the only light came from muzzle flashes and the only sound was the medevac rotors pushing wind across forward operating bases. The muscle memory didn't care that she was a civilian now. The muscle memory did its job. The patient's left arm hung off the stretcher slightly as they transferred him. Hannah caught it, steadied it, prepared it for the foreport. And that's when she saw it. The tattoo, faded from years in desert sun but unmistakable. Reaper 6. Her call sign, rendered in dark ink on the inside of his forearm, placed exactly where an operator would put it if they wanted to remember something they couldn't say aloud. Colonel Marcus Webb. Air Force combat pilot extracted from a house-to-house in Baghdad's Jolan district exactly 1,247 days ago. The man she'd carried 3 miles through streets that were actively on fire. The man she'd shielded with her own body while JSOC waited for the helicopter. The man who was supposed to forget her face because she was supposed to disappear. He was deeply sedated, his breathing controlled by the ventilator, his pupils fixed and dilated from the medications coursing through his bloodstream. He had no idea the quiet nurse in the pale blue scrubs, the one checking his drainage tubes with steady hands, was the woman who'd saved his life. Hannah kept her expression level. Jaw clenched for exactly 1 second. Then nothing. Just the professional efficiency of a nurse doing her job. She secured the central line, confirmed proper placement, made a note on the cardiac monitor. Dr. Caldwell appeared beside her within minutes, his presence arriving like humidity, unwelcome, pervasive, impossible to ignore. He looked down at Colonel Webb with a kind of detached superiority that came from never having been shot. Looks like we're going to have quite the charity case on our hands. 7 entry wounds. The surgeons are already talking about this being a miracle he survived transport. Caldwell turned to Hannah, and his voice dropped into the register he used when he wanted to humiliate someone specific. Try not to contaminate anything while you're handling him. Him? This one actually matters. Hannah said nothing. She continued her work. The drainage tubes. The monitor leads. The small things that kept people alive. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that made the hum of the fluorescent lights feel like a countdown clock. That wasn't the part that meant everything was about to shift beneath her feet, that the careful equilibrium of her disappearance was about to fracture in ways the Pentagon had never anticipated. Because Dr. Caldwell didn't know about Colonel Marcus Webb's tattoo. He didn't know about Kandahar. He didn't know that the quiet nurse he'd just wagered $50 against was a Master Chief Petty Officer with 2 silver stars and a Navy Cross gathering dust in a classified vault somewhere. All he knew was that he'd found someone to despise. And over the next 3 days, he was going to make sure everyone at Cedar Creek Medical knew it too. The cafeteria was a standard institutional rectangle at Cedar Creek Medical, beige tile, fluorescent panels, the smell of industrial gravy hanging in the air like defeat. Hannah Clarke moved through the line with a plastic tray, her movements economical, drawing no attention. Chicken. Vegetables. Water. The meal of someone who did not want to be noticed. She was halfway to a corner table when Dr. Caldwell appeared from behind the serving station, blocking her path with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. He was tall in the way privilege manufactures, shoulders squared, chin elevated, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Hannah's rent. His nameplate gleamed. Dr. Pierce Caldwell. The way he looked at her suggested he was examining a smudge on glass. You know what I told the residents this morning? His voice was pitched loud enough to carry. 3 nurses at the adjacent table stopped eating. I bet $50 this one quits within the week. These charity case hires never last. He smiled. The smile of a man who had never experienced consequence. Too soft. Can't handle real medicine. Hannah kept walking. Caldwell stepped sideways, blocking her again. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively woody. Where are you going? I'm talking to you. She didn't speak. Didn't meet his eyes. Just waited, her tray level, her breathing even. The room had gone quiet. She could feel it, that particular silence that comes when hierarchy flexes and everyone is deciding whether to watch or look away. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He expected a response. An apology. Some kind of submission. When none came, he reached out and knocked the tray from her hands. Not a shove. Precise. Deliberate. The tray spun, and food scattered across the tile in a spreading map of institutional failure. Chicken hit first. Gravy splattered in a dark arc. The plastic cup bounced twice and rolled under a nearby table, water spreading in a thin sheet across the floor. For 1 second, less than a second, Hannah's jaw clenched. A muscle contracted beneath her skin. Then her face went blank. Completely. The kind of blank that is actually a choice. She looked at the scattered meal, then back at Caldwell, her eyes flat and empty as deep ocean water. Pick it up. Caldwell's voice was softer now, which somehow made it worse. He bent down, grabbed a patient chart from the table beside him, and tossed it at her feet. The papers scattered. Come on. You're a nurse. You should be used to cleaning up messes. Pick that up, sweetheart. He said it like an insult wrapped in false concern. Like she was something that had crawled out of a drain. Hannah retrieved the chart without speaking. She collected the scattered papers, each one deliberate, methodical. Her hands were steady. Her breathing had not accelerated. She straightened, tucked the chart against her chest, and continued toward the supply room in the back of the cafeteria without acknowledging Caldwell, without acknowledging the nurses who were watching, without acknowledging any of it. The supply room was small, shelves of napkins, industrial-size condiments, cleaning supplies organized with military precision. Hannah closed the door. The lock clicked. She set the chart on the counter and allowed herself one shaking breath. Just one. Her hands trembled for approximately 3 seconds. Her jaw worked. Then she pressed her palms flat against the cold stainless steel counter and waited for the military part of her brain, the part that had been trained to absorb pain, to treat it as data rather than feeling, to reassert control. The trembling stopped. She pulled a paper towel from the dispenser, dampened it with water from the sink, and wiped her hands clean. The water was cold. She held her fingers under the flow and counted backward from 10. By the time she reached 4, her heart rate had normalized. By the time she reached 0, her face had returned to its default state, present but unremarkable. This was what 18 years of training had taught her. Not how to fight. Not how to survive. But how to endure. How to absorb disrespect and continue breathing at the same rhythm. How to be invisible inside her own skin. She returned to the ICU at 2:14 p.m., still wearing the same scrubs, having changed nothing except the expression on her face. Caldwell was in the hallway, holding court with 2 residents, explaining some procedural fine point with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. He glanced at her as she passed. The glance of someone checking whether something breakable had actually broken. When she simply moved past him without reaction, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Over the next 16 hours, Caldwell increased the pressure. A patient assignment that required Hannah to work opposite shifts from the rest of the nursing staff, isolation. A performance review notation about insufficient confidence in trauma scenarios, written deliberately where the other nurses would see him discussing it. A comment during rounds about how some people are better suited to administrative work than bedside care. Each one carefully calibrated. Each one designed to establish that Hannah Clarke was not a real nurse. Not really. Not like them. The other staff members watched. Some looked away. Some pretended not to hear. One older nurse, Diane, made eye contact with Hannah during a handoff and nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that was itself a form of resistance. But most simply continued working, which was its own kind of answer. Hannah did not acknowledge any of it. She performed her duties. She checked vitals. She reviewed medication orders. She sat beside Colonel Webb's bed during her breaks and watched his chest rise and fall, watching for the signs of infection or complication that her body could read before monitors announced them. The tattoo on his forearm remained visible, her call sign, Reaper 6, permanently inscribed in ink the color of old blood. He did not know what it meant. He did not know what it meant that she had carried him 3 miles through hostile territory. He did not know who she was at all. At 2:38 a.m. on the morning of the 14th day, the colonel's wound dressing was scheduled for routine change. Hannah was assigned to assist. She arrived in the isolation room to find Dr. Caldwell already present, reviewing the patient chart with the confidence of someone preparing for a performance. The room had that particular quality of pre-dawn silence, the kind that comes when the hospital is at its minimum staffing, when the world outside is still unconscious, when the ICU feels like a bunker beneath the earth. Colonel Webb was sedated but stable. His vitals were strong. His left chest wound, where the Iraqi bullet had torn through lung tissue and fractured 2 ribs, was healing on schedule. The dressing was simple: a sterile gauze pad, antibiotic ointment, medical tape. A procedure Hannah could perform perfectly in darkness. Caldwell insisted on leading it. That was the first sign that something was wrong. Not that he insisted, he often did. But the way he insisted. The quality of his attention. He was moving faster than protocol, already reaching for the old dressing, pulling it back before proper preparation had been completed, before Hannah had set out the sterile supplies. "Doctor, the sterile field," Hannah said quietly. He did not look at her. "I know what I'm doing." The tone was automatic, the tone of someone who had learned that volume and certainty could replace knowledge. The next words out of his mouth changed everything. "Get the new dressing ready. Now." Hannah moved to comply, understanding already that something was about to break. She could see it in the way Caldwell was handling the wound, too aggressive, too hurried, the movements of someone who was performing for an invisible audience rather than actually treating the patient. Her eyes caught on his hands. The technique was wrong. The angle was wrong. The pressure was wrong. She opened her mouth to speak. The colonel's blood pressure spike appeared on the monitor first. A sudden jump. 118/81. 125/85. The numbers climbing with terrifying speed. Hannah's hands moved toward the patient even as her mind was still calculating what had happened. Caldwell had torn the wound site. Not catastrophically, not yet, but enough that bleeding had begun. Blood seeping from beneath what should have been a healing margin. "Call it stable," Caldwell said flatly, not looking at the monitor. Hannah did not move. She was looking at the patient's face, at the subtle tension in Colonel Webb's sedated features that indicated pain even in unconsciousness. She was looking at the monitor. She was looking at Caldwell. And in that moment, something shifted. Years of military training, of classified operations, of making decisions that no civilian would ever have to make, rose up through her like a submarine breaching. The cafeteria evaporated. The humiliation evaporated. The careful construction of invisibility evaporated. "We need to control that bleeding," she said. It was not a request. It was a command. Her voice had dropped an octave. The words came out clipped and precise in the way of someone used to being obeyed. Caldwell's head snapped toward her. For a fraction of a second, he looked confused, as if a painting had suddenly started speaking. Then his face darkened. "You're a nurse. You don't." Hannah was already moving. She was already reaching for the 18-gauge needle and the sterile saline. Her hands moved like they had done this 1,000 times. Because they had. In a bunker outside of Kandahar. In a civilian hospital in Baghdad. In places that had no names and never appeared in files. The needle went in with perfect precision. The saline began to irrigate the wound, gently flushing away the blood that was beginning to accumulate in the subcutaneous space. The pressure began to stabilize. Caldwell stared at her with the expression of someone watching an impossible thing occur. Hannah's face remained neutral. Professional. But her eyes had changed. They were no longer soft. They were the color of a decision already made. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer playing a role. She was no longer anyone Caldwell could disrespect without consequence. The monitor went flat. One long note screaming across the screen like a siren nobody wanted to hear. Colonel Webb's chest wound had split open during the routine dressing change, the sterile field suddenly painted red, his blood pooling across the white sheets faster than anyone could process. Hannah saw it happen. The moment the new resident pulled the gauge away and the sutures gave way, tissue tearing with a sound like wet cloth ripping. She was already moving before his blood pressure started its death dive. 90/60. 80/50. 60/40. Get me a crash cart, Hannah said. Not a request. A command. Her voice had dropped an octave, and nobody at Cedar Creek Medical had ever heard it come from the quiet nurse before. Now. And somebody get vascular on the line, tell them we need them in trauma bay in 2 minutes, not 10. The resident froze. Caldwell was at the nurse's station, reading something on his tablet, and he looked up like a predator sensing movement in the grass. Colonel Webb's body convulsed once, the moment before consciousness left entirely. His airway was compromised. His oxygen saturation was already falling. The chest wound was bleeding out into his thoracic cavity, and in exactly 4 minutes, if that blood filled the pericardium, his heart would stop pumping entirely. Tamponade. Exsanguination. Death. Hannah was already calling it. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 4. I need surgical standing by. This is a penetrating thoracic wound with active hemorrhage. Caldwell materialized in the doorway, his face a storm. Clarke, step back from that patient. You do not have the authority to call a code without physician oversight. She didn't look at him. Her hands were already moving, for access, blood products, pushing medications through lines that suddenly meant the difference between 30 seconds of survival and 7 minutes. The hiss of air escaping the manual resuscitation bag. The steady rhythm of the monitor alarm, each beep a countdown. Surgical trauma protocol requires immediate intervention, Hannah said. Her movements had that terrifying fluid precision of someone who had seen exactly this scenario before, except last time it had been in a forward operating base 3,000 miles away with mortar fire in the distance. Your oversight can happen in theater. Right now he needs a surgeon, not a debate. I am the attending physician on this case and I will not have you. Then attend, Hannah said, and her eyes met his for exactly 1 second. The rest of her was already reaching for the crash cart, already preparing what came next. Otherwise get out of my way. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Caldwell's face flushed dark. He opened his mouth to respond, but Hannah was already cutting him off, her voice the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world had to offer. Resident, I need you on compressions. Hands here, rate of 120. Charge to 200 joules. Somebody get me 2 units of O-negative stat and call for emergency transport to the OR. They need to know we're coming with a live load and a compromised airway. The resident moved. The nurses moved. Even the nursing assistant who'd been emptying trash cans looked up and responded to the pure authority in her voice. Caldwell was standing in the doorway, watching her work with an expression that cycled through shock and rage and something darker underneath, the first cold recognition that this woman was not who he'd thought. Colonel Webb's chest was open. Not surgically open, but the wound had blown the integrity of his healing incision, and bleeding into the mediastinal space meant his heart was drowning in its own cavity. Hannah's hands moved with the certainty of muscle memory, antiseptic, sterile field, instruments laid out by someone who understood this wasn't theory or textbook procedure. This was anatomy. This was physics. This was the difference between a body that came out of the OR alive and one that didn't. I'm going in, Hannah said. Not asked. Stated. Somebody give me a surgical glove, size 7. You cannot perform open cardiac massage without a physician order, Caldwell said from the doorway, and his voice had gone cold and precise in a way that was somehow worse than his rage. This is a clear HIPAA violation and a direct infraction of hospital protocol. You are committing malpractice in front of witnesses. Hannah pulled on the glove with her teeth, tore open the sterile field with one hand while the other was already preparing the incision site. Her jaw clenched for maybe half a second. That was all. Then her face went blank, the way it had gone blank in the cafeteria when he'd knocked her tray down. The way it had gone blank when he'd thrown the chart at her feet. Direct cardiac massage protocol, she said to the room, completely ignoring him. 14-gauge needle for pericardial access. 14 gauge. Do not make me say it again. The surgical resident handed it to her before Caldwell could issue a countermanding order. Hannah's hands were steady, steadier than should have been possible, as she found the xiphoid process, the space between the ribs, the precise anatomical landmark that meant the needle went where it needed to go and nowhere else. The hiss of fluid escaping under pressure. The monitor started climbing. 72. 78. 85. Her hands were literally inside his chest now. Direct cardiac massage through an open thoracotomy, not something a nurse was supposed to be doing, not something a nurse was trained to do, not something that was anything except a direct violation of every hospital protocol Caldwell could cite. But her hands were moving like instruments themselves, finding the cardiac outline through the blood and tissue, maintaining compression with a rhythm that was giving him oxygen, that was keeping his heart beating when it should have stopped 3 minutes ago. 89. 91. 94. Stable. Surgical team. Hannah said. No please. No courtesy. No deference. 2 minutes, someone said from a phone somewhere. He'll be alive in 1, Hannah said. It wasn't arrogance. It was just information. Keep the O2 running. Push another milligram of epi. Get me type and cross for 6 units when we hit the OR. Caldwell was still in the doorway. His face had gone a particular shade of pale that meant he understood he'd just watched a very ordinary-looking nurse perform an extraordinary emergency procedure that had saved Colonel Webb's life through pure competence and combat-level precision. That's enough, Caldwell said. His voice was shaking. That is enough. Hands off that patient immediately. I am ordering you to step back. Hannah's eyes didn't leave Colonel Webb's chest. Her hands didn't stop their steady compression. She was covered in his blood now, and there was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty, no moment where she questioned whether she was doing this right. She knew. Her body knew. The way she moved, the language she'd used, the absolute certainty in every motion, Caldwell was finally looking at someone he couldn't dismiss as just a nurse. Surgical team at the door, someone called out. Hannah's hands were inside a dying man's chest, and she was keeping him alive with nothing but training and will and the kind of knowledge that came from places nobody talked about, places nobody was supposed to know existed. He's yours, Hannah said to the surgeon, and she withdrew her hands with the same precision she'd used to place them, maintaining compression with the surgical team even as they moved him to their stretcher, her blood-soaked scrubs evidence of what she'd just done. The surgeon looked at her once, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition of another trained person. Another professional operating at a level that went beyond hospital protocol into pure medicine. Good work, he said. Then he was gone, and so was Colonel Webb, and Hannah was standing in the trauma bay covered in his blood while Caldwell stood in the doorway with his phone already in his hand. She could see him making calculations behind his eyes. She could see him understanding, finally, that he'd chosen the wrong person to break. You're done, Caldwell said quietly. I don't know what that was, but you just committed every violation I need. I'm calling the board right now. Hannah pulled off the glove. She set it down carefully. She looked at him directly for the first time since the code had started, and her eyes were the color of someone who had seen things in places that no longer officially existed. Then call them, she said. The monitor climbed. 85. 90. Then the beautiful flat line of sinus rhythm. The room went dead silent. His back, Hannah said. Nobody moved. Colonel Marcus Webb's chest rose and fell under her hands, his heart beating on its own again, and for 3 seconds the entire trauma bay held its breath. Then Dr. Caldwell's face shifted. Not relief. Something else. Something that looked like rage watching its own defeat walk away. He was already moving before Hannah stepped back from the bed. Already pulling his phone from his coat pocket as he strode past the surgical team, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on something distant and calculating. Hannah watched him disappear into the corridor and knew, with a certainty that came from 23 years of reading men under pressure, that she had made a mistake. Not in saving the colonel. In doing it in a way that made Caldwell look incompetent in front of everyone who mattered. The next 12 hours happened in a blur of paperwork and administrative silence. Hannah was sent home at shift change with a verbal notice that her actions were under review. It was professional language for what it actually meant. They were building a case. She drove home through San Antonio's evening traffic at 4:27 p.m., her uniform still damp with someone else's blood, her hand steady on the steering wheel because soldiers didn't shake, and when she walked into her kitchen, she sat down at the table and waited for the weight of it to hit. It took 20 minutes. The composure broke like thin ice. Her daughter found her there, Elena, 16, home early from debate team, and stopped in the doorway, her backpack sliding from her shoulder. Hannah's eyes were burning, but soldiers didn't cry, so instead her vision just blurred and her shoulders folded in on themselves, and she couldn't find words that made sense. Mom. Elena's voice climbed. Mom, what's wrong? Why are you home? Hannah couldn't answer. She opened her mouth and nothing came except breath that wouldn't steady, and her daughter crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around her mother's shoulders, confused and frightened in a way that made everything worse because Elena had already lost one parent to work, and now she was losing the other to something that looked like failure. By 6:13 a.m. the next morning, Hannah was walking into Cedar Creek Medical for what she didn't yet know would be the last time. The day shift was already gathered, 47 nurses, residents, attendings, all moving through morning rounds with their usual rhythm. She didn't make it to the ICU. Security was waiting at the employee entrance. 2 officers she recognized, their expressions professionally neutral, which was worse than anger. Behind them stood Dr. Caldwell in a tailored blazer, his arms crossed, flanked by hospital administration and a lawyer in a $5,000 suit who'd flown in from Dallas on the red-eye. Hannah knew the look of a man who had activated his network. She'd seen it before, in boardrooms and command posts where careers got built on other people's ruin. Hannah Clarke, one of the administrators, said, "Roberta Chen, VP of Nursing." Her voice was gentle, which meant the decision was already made. "We need your badge and credentials. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation into protocol violations and patient care conduct." The words came in sequence: protocol violation, patient safety concern, independent review, licensing board notification. Hannah watched Caldwell's expression stay carefully neutral as his lawyer explained the investigation timeline. 3 board members he'd contacted yesterday had already filed complaints about her unsupervised cardiac intervention. The state nursing board had flagged her license for review based on an anonymous tip. A private investigator had already been contracted to examine her employment history, which would show, if you read between the right lines, that Hannah Clarke had appeared in San Antonio 7 months ago with no prior verifiable work history, no references that would return calls, and a social security number that went dark for 12 years before that. She handed over her badge without a word. It fell silent in the employee area. 47 people had stopped moving. They watched, the day shift, the night nurses still wrapping up, the residents, the attending physicians, as Hannah turned in her credentials and walked toward the exit. Caldwell's expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders relax, the slight exhale of a man who had just neutralized a threat using the tools that men like him always used: authority, connections, and the machinery of institutions designed to protect people exactly like him. The drive home took 17 minutes. Hannah moved through traffic on automatic, turn signal, lane change, brake light, her hand steady but her mind moving through angles and consequences. The investigation would take 2 to 3 weeks minimum. The nursing board review would take longer. And somewhere in that process, they would discover that Hannah Clarke's employment history had gaps, that her references didn't match official records, that her background was a carefully constructed lie maintained by people who no longer returned her calls. She sat at the kitchen table at 11:38 a.m. on a Tuesday, in the same chair where her daughter had found her crying the night before, and understood that she had been erased. Not officially. Not yet. but the machinery had started, and the machinery always finished what it began. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She had 3 numbers memorized, emergency contacts from a life that was supposed to stay buried. She never called them. The orders had been explicit: you surface, you die. You reach out, they have to deny you. You're safer if you're invisible. But invisible had failed. Invisible had gotten her fired from the only job that had felt real in 12 years. Hannah reached for the drawer where she kept her running shoes, muscle memory from a different life finding the spot without thought. Under them, wrapped in a navy athletic bag, was a pair of combat boots. They were army issue, badly scuffed, the left one still stained with mud from the Kandahar Valley. She'd kept them against every regulation, against every training requirement. They were evidence. Proof that she'd existed as someone other than a nurse named Hannah Clarke. She held them and thought about throwing them away. About calling a lawyer. About driving to the Mexican border and disappearing properly this time, not half measures, not civilian clothes and a new social security number. Completely gone. Reaper 6 fully dissolved. The boots felt heavy in her hands. Elena would find out eventually. The state board would dig. Caldwell would keep pressing, and men like him always won because they used the system against people who tried to follow the system. Hannah set the boots on the table and stared at them and thought about Marcus Webb, sedated in the ICU she'd just been fired from, with her call sign tattooed on his arm. He'd asked for her by name when he woke up yesterday, and the night nurse had said she'd passed along the message. He'd been looking for her. And then the sound came. It started distant, a low percussion in the air, the kind of sound that didn't belong in Tuesday morning traffic on the south side of San Antonio. Hannah's head came up. Her training recognized it before her conscious mind did: helicopter rotors, multiple sets, moving fast, heading toward the medical district. She stood. The boots fell to the tile floor with a soft thud. The rotor sound grew louder, the distinctive thump of heavy lift aircraft, the kind used for emergency transport and military operations. Hannah moved to her kitchen window and watched 3 UH-60M Blackhawks cross the skyline above Cedar Creek Medical, their shadows sliding across the buildings like they were being hunted by something airborne. And she understood, with absolute clarity, that her daughter's terrified face in the kitchen yesterday wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of the next chapter. The helicopter rotors shook the windows before anyone heard the sirens. The Blackhawks descended through San Antonio's afternoon haze like something out of a classified briefing, and the medical center's ambulance bay erupted into chaos. 30 personnel in dress blues poured out in formation, their uniforms so crisp they looked laminated, and they moved through Cedar Creek Medical's main entrance with the kind of purposeful stride that made orderlies step back without being told to move. Nobody announced them. Nobody had to. A master sergeant with a chest full of medals walked directly to the administration floor. His boots echoed on tile, each step deliberate, each footfall a drumbeat. He found the conference room where Hannah sat across from 3 hospital administrators and a lawyer Caldwell had flown in from Dallas. The sergeant didn't knock. He opened the door and spoke one word into the silence. Reaper 6. Hannah's head came up. Not slowly. Not surprised. Her eyes met his and something ancient passed between them, the recognition of 2 people who had bled in the same sand, carried the same weight. The room didn't understand what had just happened. They were about to find out. The hospital's security guard, a Navy veteran named Patterson with 22 years of service and the bearing to prove it, went pale. He was standing near the elevators when the master sergeant passed, and Patterson's eyes locked on the rank insignia, on the bearing, on the presence that seemed to compress the air itself. He reached for his radio and keyed it with a voice that had practiced this exact announcement for scenarios he'd never expected to live. Master Chief on deck. Hospitals aren't built for military protocol, but muscle memory doesn't care about architecture. Nurses paused mid-stride. A resident froze with a tablet halfway to his chest. Even Dr. Caldwell, standing near the coffee station on the 3rd floor, stopped mid-sip. The words meant something. The words meant everything. Hannah was escorted from the conference room by 2 airmen in dress uniform. She didn't ask questions. She didn't stumble. She walked between them with her spine straight, and for the first time since arriving at Cedar Creek Medical 6 weeks ago, she moved like what she actually was. The 2-star general was waiting in the main hospital corridor. His name was Major General Richard Holloway, and his presence filled the space the way hurricane fills sky. He wasn't large, he was average height, average build, but he carried authority the way some people carry oxygen. You needed it to breathe near him. He stood in front of Hannah with his uniform pressed so tight it looked like it had been carved from a single block of granite, and he began to speak. His voice was quiet. That was the terrifying part. Bronze Star for Valor in Kandahar Province, 2019. He paused. The corridor had gone completely silent. Silver Star for Exceptional Gallantry Under Fire, 2020. Another Silver Star, 2021. For Purple Hearts, 1 from shrapnel, 1 from a gunshot wound to the left shoulder, 1 from fragmentation, 1 from burns sustained while extracting personnel from a burning convoy. He stopped between each medal and let the words settle like snow. Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism while protecting a fellow service member under sustained hostile fire. And a classified commendation, his eyes found Dr. Caldwell, for successfully extracting 17 personnel from a black site location in Kandahar despite a 6-hour firefight, including 1 Colonel Marcus Webb who was thought to be KIA. The general turned toward the ICU. Colonel Webb was standing in the hallway in a hospital gown, his feet bare, his wound still fresh enough that his left arm was heavily bandaged. He was still healing. He wasn't supposed to be standing. But he was here, and when he saw Hannah, his face crumpled like paper. He didn't speak. He just held up his left forearm. The tattoo was darker than his skin, faded from 4 years of sun and calluses, but the letters were unmistakable. Reaper 6. Her call sign. Her name in a language only certain people could read. His eyes filled with tears, actual tears, running down his face, because he understood now. The quiet nurse who'd checked his vitals 16 times, who'd monitored his drainage tubes, who'd been kind to him when he was lost in sedation, was the operator who'd kept him alive through 3 miles of open ground and incoming fire. The colonel tried to speak and couldn't. He just showed the room what was written on his arm. The hospital's administrator, a woman named Patricia Moss who'd been with Cedar Creek for 9 years, watched the tattoo reveal itself and felt something shift in her understanding of what had been happening in her building. General Holloway turned to face Dr. Caldwell. The doctor was standing near the medication station, his face moving through the colors of panic, white, then red, then gray. The general's voice, when he spoke, was softer than it had been before. Which made it worse. You are terminated, effective immediately. Your medical license will be flagged by the state board, and your name will be forwarded to the medical review authority. He paused. 1 breath. If you contest this termination, I will personally declassify the operational details of Master Chief Clarke's assignment and ensure that you explain to federal investigators exactly how and why you compromised her security clearance and endangered an active operator in protective status. Caldwell's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands were shaking. He looked toward the hospital's lawyer, but Patterson the security guard had stepped forward and was positioning himself between the doctor and the exits. 1 hand on his belt. Not threatening. Not yet. Just present. The administrator, Patricia Moss, stepped forward with her phone already in her hand. Behind the formation of Air Force personnel, 3 camera crews from local news stations were setting up equipment. They'd followed the convoy from the moment those Black Hawks landed, sensing the story before they understood the story. Moss looked directly at Caldwell while the cameras rolled. Your employment with Cedar Creek Medical is terminated as of this moment. You are to clear your personal items from your office and leave the premises within 2 hours, or we will have security remove you. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your registered address. Caldwell tried to argue. His voice came out strangled, desperate, the sound of a man watching everything collapse in real time. But nobody was listening. The general had already turned away. Hannah was being introduced to Colonel Webb, who was reaching out his good arm and pulling her into an embrace that made his fresh wound sing with pain, but he didn't care. Nobody cared about his pain anymore. The general gave a formal commendation ceremony in Cedar Creek's cafeteria 2 hours later. 30 Air Force personnel stood at attention while Holloway pinned Hannah's medals to the borrowed dress uniform they'd brought for her. The hospital staff lined the walls. Some of them had been present in the cafeteria weeks ago when Caldwell had knocked the tray from her hands. Some of them had watched her pick up the chart without flinching. Some of them had witnessed her stoic silence while being insulted. Now they watched the quiet nurse who had mopped floors and asked please and said sorry stand at attention while a 2-star general saluted her. 6 months later, Hannah walked into the VA hospital in San Antonio, the new one, built on the north side with a trauma wing that hadn't existed before. She was the chief nursing officer. Her office was small, but it was hers. And on the shelf behind her desk, next to a folded American flag in a glass case and a photograph of her daughter's college graduation, sat a pair of combat boots. The leather was creased and scarred. The sole was worn thin in the heel from 48 hours of running through Kandahar's rocky terrain. The left boot still had dark stains that might have been blood or might have been dust. She'd never cleaned them. She'd never let anyone clean them. She kept them as a reminder. Not of the darkness, but of the weight that mattered more than hiding. Of the 3 miles she'd carried a man through fire. Of the years she'd sacrificed to stay invisible. Of the moment she'd chosen to step back into the light. One afternoon, a young nurse named Marcus came into her office looking rattled. He'd just come from the cafeteria where he'd overheard 2 orderlies talking about how Dr. Stephen Caldwell was working the afternoon shift at an urgent care clinic in Tucson now, selling supplemental insurance from a folding table in the parking lot on weekends. The name tag read Steve. He flinched when patients called him doctor. He'd lost his medical license. Lost his position. Lost everything he'd built on the foundation of other people's fear. That's what happens, Hannah said quietly, when you measure yourself by the people you can hurt instead of the people you can save. Marcus didn't understand the reference. He left her office thinking she was talking about karma or justice or the general arc of consequence. He wasn't wrong. But he was also missing the deeper truth, which was that Hannah Clarke had spent for years measuring herself by a different scale entirely. By lives saved. By distances covered. By the weight of a man's gratitude and the space between fear and the choice to act anyway. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the force of a master chief who'd learned to exist in a space so small that nobody could see what she actually was. And when the moment came to expand again, to take up the space she'd earned, she did it without fanfare or anger or the kind of theatrical revenge that makes for good stories but bad character. She did it with the same quiet precision she'd used to save 7 lives bleeding out in a hospital bed. She did it by showing up. By being competent. By letting her work speak louder than any uniform ever could. Her daughter called that evening. The first thing she asked was about the combat boots. Still in your office? Every day, Hannah said. Why? Hannah looked at the photograph on her wall, her daughter at graduation, smiling in a way that suggested she'd finally accepted that her mother was something more complicated than she'd thought. Because scars tell stories. And some stories need to stay visible so others know what survival looks like. The next morning, Hannah was back in the trauma bay checking vitals on a 19-year-old kid with 3 GSWs who'd come in during the night. She wore scrubs, not a uniform. Her name badge said Chief Clarke, but her hands moved like they always had, steady, precise, knowing exactly where the next problem was before the monitor even announced it. A resident was watching her, trying to understand how she'd become a legend in 6 months. She didn't know that Hannah was training her to see what she'd learned in the dark. That every correction, every suggestion, every moment of patience was a transfer of something that couldn't be taught in nursing school. This was what true class looked like. Not the kind that waits for recognition. The kind that shows up at 3 in the morning and saves lives while asking nothing in return. The kid was going to make it. Hannah already knew. She could read it in his vitals, in the way his lungs were responding to the interventions, in the simple fact that he was still fighting. She'd carried people much closer to the edge. "Good work," the resident said. "How do you know to try the second line when the first infiltrated?" Hannah was already moving toward the next patient. 19 years of paying attention. The resident didn't ask follow-up questions. Everybody at the VA hospital had learned by now that Hannah Clarke's answers came in single sentences, but those sentences were usually all you needed. What happened in those halls, in those rooms where the wounded became whole, was nobody's war but theirs. And Hannah had learned, a long time ago, that the people worth respecting were the ones who could hold incredible weight and never once ask for credit. True class is what you do when the lights go out. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.